I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I didn't realize it'd been 25th anniversary. Avner has invited me a few times before, but well, I'm delighted to be here. I really enjoyed reading the paper. When I teach PhD students, I tell them, in corporate finance, capital budgeting, we have a lot of things to say. We are confident. When it comes to the capital structure issues, well, we start hedging a little bit. Our main theories, at least we have some main theories, but our main theories are not standing up to data that well, etc. When it comes to dividends, we are completely throwing up our hands. We don't have good theories, and empirical evidence oftentimes doesn't seem to match theories. So I sort of feel a little bit like that reading this paper. On one hand, I want to say I was, on one hand, so on one hand, the paper wants to understand fairly important regularity in dividends. That is, when dividend taxes change, there doesn't seem to be a big response in taxable dividends. So this has been a puzzle. I noticed in preparing for the discussion, I noticed there is a completely almost a separate strand of the literature where they don't refer to the finance papers that much, but they have also theories and a lot of empirical work, a slew of papers after the 2003 dividend cut, and all kinds of very impressive names. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But the truth is, it's not clear there is a good theory. I'm going to explain that, obviously. So what Martin seemed to say somewhere, that we have these great theories which imply high response of taxable dividends, and of course the puzzle has been that the response has been slow, and in this particular setting they have very good data, very detailed data on these shocks to the dividend taxes in the Swedish setting. I hope it is Sweden and not Norway. It's Sweden, right? Yeah. So anyway, but having said that, though, as Martin said, what we're trying to understand is, when dividend taxes change, is there a big response to the taxable dividends? That's sort of the main question. And the immediate, after you're impressed with the detailed data they have and the very good empirical work they have done, the next question is, what is the external validity of these things? Can we learn something about this to listed firms, publicly traded firms? Can we learn something about this to the US, to solve our own puzzles? Why there has been a relatively low response to 2003 dividend cut, and so on and so forth. So I thought, okay, well, the answer lies in, we need to find out what's going on. In other words, we need to have a theory of why this is going on. And I'm going to argue, contrary to what Martin claimed, that we don't really have a good theory. Okay, so now their result is, when the managers and owners are aligned, they are closely held firms. When there is a dominant manager entrepreneur kind of a setting, then of course what is going on is that the manager is fine-tuning what they distribute through wages as opposed to what they distribute through dividends. That's a good setting. And of course, when there is one dominant manager, there is a big response. But when there is dispersed shareholders, the response is very muted. I'm going to go to the theoretical aspect. So one of the I'm going to argue actually the theoretical framework here is very weak. In fact, these papers really do not analyze the problem. They don't have implications which tell us much about taxable dividends and the responsiveness of dividends. So two papers that the authors rely on is by Raj Chetty and Emmanuel Saez. There are a slew of papers. These are the two ones the authors cite, but there is at least a handful of papers published in very good places, QJE, AER, and so on. But I'm going to argue that they don't have a theory of how taxable dividends should respond to tax changes. Now, let me argue that Martin and co-authors also do not have really a theory of distributions. They don't have a theory how much is the total that the shareholders and the owners want to take out of the firms, the total being wages plus dividends plus repurchases. What they're really doing is, given that they're taking out a certain moment, how does the taxes influence whether they tilt towards dividends or tilt towards wages? Now, this might be relevant for small or relatively unlisted firms, or where there isn't anything else going on. It's really the split between wages and dividends. But the literature that I mentioned actually addresses the issue of publicly traded firms. Now, here what is going on is the Chetty and Saez papers, they do not really have a theory of either total payouts or that of cash dividends. What is the optimal cash dividends that the firm would pay? We need that because, after all, the dividend taxation impacts the cash dividends. So we need a theory of that. Without that, we cannot say much. What happens in these papers, I don't have a lot of time. What happens in these papers is there's a certain amount of cash. They determine the optimal investment, and the residual is paid out as dividends. Now, we know from M&M, if you have well-functioning capital markets, the residual dividend policy is just an arbitrary policy. There is no optimality to it. And in these models, what they're assuming is, in fact, perfect capital markets where they can raise any amount of money from the outside. So their assumption of residual dividend policy is giving them a lot of the results. More importantly, so for example, some of the implications they highlight is that you'll never find a firm paying equity finance dividends. You would not find a firm raising equity and paying dividends in the same horizon. We know that's falsified by data. And then what is more outrageous is that they say, oh, by the way, we do not have an explanation why firms would pay tax disadvantaged cash dividends. That's, they say, a shortcoming of our paper is that we have no justification why firms would pay cash dividends. That's a big shortcoming. That is the whole ball game. If you do not have a model of how firms pay cash dividend, which are of course impacted by these taxes, you do not have anything, okay? Because, for example, the optimal cash dividend to pay in those models are actually zero cash dividends for any positive tax rate, the dividend tax rate, okay? So, of course, if my optimal cash dividend is zero for a tax rate of 10%, it's the same for a tax rate of 15%. The theoretical prediction, the main theoretical prediction is that there should be no response. So it's not clear at all that the theory is telling you that there should be a big response. This is a basic M&M they should have known it. So as far as I'm concerned, this whole literature hasn't really given us a theory which tells us the real story. Okay, let me quickly make a caveat. Could these papers be that wrong? And the answer is yes, they are that wrong. Now these are, we all know, I mean, I'm a big fan of Raj Shetty, for example. So I know these guys he's done all kinds of clever work, but in the dividend area, they have to read the literature. They haven't read the finance literature. Let me humbly say, they don't know anything about dividends. Now, I remember just in our early days, Avner used to say, Avner would read a dividend paper, and he would come to me and say, Kose, I don't know how to say this, but we have to license doing research in dividends. You know? License economist. That's right, that's right. All right. Let me go on. What I think, this is not to criticize the papers alone. Let me give a little bit of suggestion for the advisors. Let me give a little advice. This is what they should be doing. First, you need a model of not the sum total of repurchases plus cash dividends. You need a model of cash dividends, because ultimately the tax rate changes are going to primarily impact taxable dividends. Okay, so you need a model of cash dividend, and then you have to ask yourself, well, how does the ownership structure change the cash dividends that is being paid? So that's when we can understand something about this. Now there are some finance papers as early as Rosev had a paper. For example, Rosev had a paper how dispersion of ownership would be affected by the ownership structure. Ownership structure affects dividends, and dispersion of ownership was a big variable in the Rosev paper. I'm going to randomly pick a couple of other papers. So, for example, this is when you said Swedish firms. Let's say one reason for paying taxable dividends is asymmetric information. Yeah. Now you can say asymmetric information in small Swedish firms where you have a dominant decision-making manager. You know, he's not that worried about asymmetric information. Now, whereas if you have dispersed ownership and the manager is worried that the dispersed shareholders may do something which not to take into account the information setting, so there the ownership structure might have an impact on how much taxable cash dividends the company would pay. I should also say there is a whole slew of agency models which also have the agency motivation of dividends coming from the ownership structure. Okay? Now, again, the Miller-Roth model, which is a very good model, they cannot deliver the results because their model is about the total, the net dividends paid out of the firm. Their model is not about cash dividends, but you need a model where the taxable cash dividends would optimally be paid out for whatever reasons, and then ask, how does the ownership structure impact that? But having said all this, I want to say it's a very interesting set of results, intriguing, and the question is only how far. What do we learn about listed firms? What do we learn about various settings? So I'm looking forward to the revision. Don't trust papers just because they're written by famous people. Enjoy this paper. I recommend it to everybody. Thank you.